The sun hung low in the sky, a merciless furnace above the valley. Its heat pressed down, suffocating everything beneath it. The earth cracked beneath the weight of the summer, and the air shimmered with waves of heat. A dull haze bled across the horizon, turning the world into an unrecognizable blur of dust and bone-white light. Among the scorched fields, Min worked. Her back bent low, hands stained and calloused from years of labor. Every movement was a carefully measured effort, driven not by hope but by necessity. Her prairie dress, darkened with sweat, clung to her, clinging as if to the very bones beneath. Each time she bent to pull a root from the parched earth, her muscles stretched tight, pulled taut by the brutal demands of a life that had long since worn down her will to hope. Around her, others moved like ghosts, shadows of people worn thin by the same endless grind. The air was heavy, laden with the smell of dry earth and sweat. No one spoke. No one dared. They were bound, each one shackled by invisible chains to a life that offered nothing but more of the same. A slow, unyielding destruction. And then, through the haze, a figure appeared. At first he was nothing more than a silhouette, a dark shape against the endless brightness. His figure loomed like a threat in the oppressive heat, but as he drew closer, the details became clearer. A tall man, lean but solid, with a kind of quiet presence that made the land around him seem to hold its breath. His wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but even from a distance there was something about him. A hardness. A purpose. He wasn't here for trouble, but it was clear trouble was something he had seen far too much of. His horse, sturdy and steady, picked its way through the dirt, each step deliberate. The rider moved with a quiet confidence, his every motion calculated, purposeful. He dismounted near the foreman's shack, and for a long moment his gaze swept over the fields, over the workers. It lingered on Min, her form bent, her hands moving like a machine, her spirit like the earth beneath her, a hard, weathered thing. Silas stood for a moment, watching her, not with pity, not with judgment, but with something far deeper, recognition, a shared understanding of the weight of the world, the load that never seemed to lessen. He took the job no one wanted, digging irrigation ditches. It was back-breaking, sweat-drenched work, but it put him in the path of the fields. From his position in the trenches, he could observe it all, the quiet suffering, the tension, the fear. His eyes always returned to Min. He watched as Elias Vance, the foreman, moved among the workers with the kind of predatory energy that left nothing but unease in its wake. Vance was a man of authority, but not of respect. His voice was a whip crack, his words sharp and venomous. Silas watched as Vance kicked over a water bucket, watching it spill into the dirt, a small but vicious act that showed just how far the foreman would go to break these people. The workers, too weary to fight back, kept their heads down, their eyes trained on the ground. Fear was the only thing that seemed to grow here. But minimum, she was different. She had a quiet strength, a dignity in her every movement that seemed to defy the world around her. Vance's cruel eyes always sought her out, always found a way to make her work harder, break her more. But each time, she would rise again, like a dry twig that, no matter how much it was bent, refused to snap. One afternoon, as the sun reached its highest point, Silas saw her falter. She stumbled, a hand coming to her temple as if the weight of the heat itself had struck her. He gripped his shovel tighter, his knuckles white, feeling a tightness in his chest that wasn't from the work. He couldn't ignore it. Without thinking, he climbed from the ditch, grabbed his canteen from his horse, and walked toward her. When she saw him approach, her eyes narrowed, filled with suspicion. This wasn't a place for kindness. It was a place for survival. Offering help, even something as simple as water, could cost you dearly here. Min hesitated for a long moment, her eyes flicking over to Vance, who was shouting at another worker in the distance. Finally, she reached out, taking the canteen from him. Her hand brushed against his, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. She drank quickly, 2 short swallows, and handed it back. "Gracias," she whispered, barely above the wind's whisper. Silas gave a small, silent nod, a gesture that spoke louder than words. He didn't need to say anything. Respect had been exchanged, and in this place, that was a currency far more valuable than water. The next day, the air felt heavier, thicker. Tension hung like a storm cloud. Vance had seen the exchange, or someone had reported it to him, and now there was a storm brewing. The opportunity for cruelty arrived in the form of a wagon loaded with seed sacks, stranded just a short distance from the barn. It was a two-man job, but Vance wasn't one for fairness. "You," he barked at Min, a twisted smile creeping onto his face. "The wagon needs unloading. Get those sacks to the barn." The workers around her held their breath, waiting. The job wasn't just difficult, it was meant to break her. Each sack weighed nearly 100 pounds, a punishment disguised as work. Min didn't argue. She simply nodded, her face a mask of stoic determination, and started toward the wagon. But Silas watched her go. His jaw tightened, his whole body coiled with silent rage. This wasn't just a task, it was a challenge, and he couldn't stand by and watch her carry it alone. He stood and walked toward her, his steps calm, but each one heavier than the last. Min noticed him then, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, but she didn't stop. This was her fight, her burden to bear. They reached the wagon. Min bent to lift the first sack, her small frame straining beneath its weight. Silas stepped in front of her, his shadow falling over her like a protective blanket. He didn't speak at first, just took the sack from her hands and set it on the ground. "Let me carry that load," he said quietly, his voice steady, unwavering. His words were not a suggestion. They were a statement. Min froze, the weight of the sack pressing into her shoulders. Vance was already making his way toward them, his eyes burning with fury. The foreman's voice rang out in the distance, full of menace. And so the confrontation began. Vance's steps quickened, the slow, deliberate stride of a man with something to prove. He reached them, his face twisted with rage. His eyes narrowed into slits. His hand hovered near the handle of his whip, the leather coiling and uncoiling in his mind, as if it was already in his grasp. Silas didn't flinch. He stood there, as calm as the desert before a storm, the weight of the sack still resting at his feet. Min's eyes flickered between them, the tension in her body evident, but she said nothing. This was a battle she had no desire to fight, and now, it seemed, one that wasn't hers alone anymore. Vance's voice broke the silence, harsh and biting, like the crack of a whip. "What do you think you're doing, Drifter?" He spat. His eyes were fixed on Silas, ignoring Min completely, as if she were nothing more than the dust beneath his boots. "I gave the woman an order." Silas's gaze didn't waver. He simply looked at Vance, as if seeing through him, through the posturing, the arrogance. His voice was low, but there was no doubt in it. "The work will get done." It wasn't a request. The words hung in the air between them, as sharp and heavy as the heat pressing down on the land. It was more than just defiance. It was a challenge, one that Vance wasn't prepared for. The foreman's face flushed, his mouth twisting into a sneer that was as ugly as the dirt they worked in. "I give the orders here, Drifter," Vance growled, his voice thick with menace. He took a step forward, his bulk blocking the sunlight, his shadow falling over Silas like a threat. But Silas didn't move. He was rooted, solid, in a way that made Vance's anger boil. The foreman's hand twitched towards his whip, but something in Silas's stillness, his quiet power, made him hesitate. In that moment, something shifted. Vance's next words came with a biting edge of humiliation. "You'll do the job you're paid for, and the woman will do the job I told her to." Silas didn't respond. He bent down slowly, lifting the sack as if it were little more than a sack of grain. The action, so simple, so effortless, was a stark contrast to the rage churning in the foreman's gut. He turned his back on Vance, walking toward the barn with a steady, unhurried pace. The sound of the sack shifting over his shoulder was the only noise that dared to break the heavy silence. Vance's words died in the dust behind him, the foreman's fury growing by the second, but powerless against Silas's quiet strength. Min stood motionless, watching Silas carry the burden she had been assigned. There was a strange, painful weight in her chest as she followed his steps with her eyes. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the audacity, the sheer courage it took to stand up to a man like Vance, a man like Thorne. She had been breaking her back under the same sun, the same whip, for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to be offered something as simple as respect. It was dangerous to be seen in this place, to matter. But Silas had seen her. Min swallowed hard, trying to ignore the feeling of something stirring in her chest. It was the same feeling she had when she thought about running, when she allowed herself to imagine a life outside these fields, a life where her worth was not measured by how much she could carry or how far she could bend under the sun's unrelenting heat. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. She had to fight that thought. It was too dangerous. Silas made it to the barn, leaving the sack where it needed to be. The air was still, heavy with the weight of a world that had no mercy. Silas wiped the sweat from his brow, glancing back toward the field. The workers, as they always did, kept their heads low, avoiding the scene as though it were a fire burning too close to their own lives. Min walked slowly toward the barn, each step heavy with the unspoken tension that had crept into the air. She reached the door, but before she could step inside, Silas's voice stopped her. "Minimum." She turned toward him. His face was still unreadable, but his eyes held something in them, a quiet intensity that made her heart skip. He had stood up for her. It was more than just a physical act of carrying a heavy load. He had done something that no one else had dared to do. He had reminded her that she was more than a cog in a machine, and she hated it. "Thank you," she whispered, barely above the wind. Silas gave a short nod, but his eyes lingered on her for just a moment longer before he turned and walked toward the fields again. There was something about the way he moved, the way he carried himself, that felt like a promise. It wasn't one made with words, but one made with actions. Back in the fields, Min felt the weight of the day pressing down on her again, but this time, it was different. The oppressive weight was now shared, if only for a brief moment. She lifted her head higher, straightening her back, and continued working. But this time, her thoughts weren't on the tasks ahead. They were on the man who had given her a brief taste of something she hadn't known she needed: respect. And she had no idea how dangerous that could be. Later that evening, as the last light of the day slipped away behind the hills, Silas found himself by the water trough, washing the grime from his hands. The cool water felt like relief against his skin, but it did little to cool the fire that had been kindled within him today. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't have to look to know who it was. He could feel her presence before she spoke. Min stood there, her eyes dark but calm, a strip of cloth in her hand. Silas turned toward her, his gaze softening when he saw the cut on his forearm, a shallow wound from the rough burlap of the sacks. He hadn't even noticed it until now. Her small hand reached out, offering the cloth without a word. Silas hesitated for a moment, then took it. Their fingers brushed again, this time lingering for just a second longer. She didn't say anything. Neither of them did. But in that silence, something shifted between them, a quiet bond, fragile but real. The days that followed seemed to stretch on forever, the heat pressing down, the tasks endless and monotonous. Yet, something had changed, subtly, imperceptibly. Min couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but she felt it in the air between her and Silas. A silent understanding, a connection that was forged not in words but in actions, small, quiet acts of care that seemed to say everything without being spoken aloud. She had never been good at receiving kindness, not in this place. It felt like an invitation to be broken. But Silas didn't ask for anything in return. He simply did. He did it without expectation. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Min returned to her small, dilapidated shack after a long day in the fields. The door creaked open, and there, on the roof, a patch of new planks had been added, sealing the leak that had caused the constant drips inside during the rainstorms. The makeshift repairs were rough, but they were solid. They were done. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring up at the roof, her heart thudding. She knew it hadn't been her hands that had done the work. Silas had come while she was in the fields, taken the time to fix something she never could have done herself. He hadn't asked for thanks, hadn't expected anything. It was simply done. She didn't know what to make of it. The next day, as she trudged back from the field, her body aching from the endless toil, Min found something waiting for her near her shack, a small bowl of warm, savory porridge. She stood over it for a long moment, unsure. Her gaze flickered toward Silas's camp, but there was no sign of him, no words, no explanation, just the simple gesture. She knew it was his. She knew it was an offering. She hadn't seen him eat much at all, but she had noticed that his eyes had lingered on her food before. He had nothing to spare, yet somehow he had found the will to give. It was a rare thing, a kindness like that. Without thinking, she sat down on the crate beside the bowl and dug in. It was more than she could afford to share, more than she'd ever expect. But somehow, Silas had shared it. And though she couldn't explain it, the simple act of eating that bowl made her feel lighter. Not full, not satisfied, but seen. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, like stepping into a world where she wasn't just a body that worked, a person who carried the weight. That night, as the dark sky stretched out overhead, Min found herself near the creek bed again. Her eyes turned toward the stars. The world had a way of feeling endless here, stretched thin by the heat, the dust, the pain. But the stars felt like something different. They were constant. They reminded her that there was still beauty out there, even here, even now. As if summoned by the silence of the evening, Silas appeared at the edge of the creek. He didn't speak right away, but his presence was enough. He stood there, looking down at her, his eyes unreadable. "Min," he finally said, his voice low, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You didn't have to." She didn't look up. She couldn't. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small handful of sunflower seeds she had been carrying for the last few days, ever since she'd planted them near her shack. They were her silent rebellion, her small act of hope in a place that had none. "You said you liked sunflowers," she murmured, the words barely a whisper. "I'm saving them. For something better." Silas's gaze shifted to the seeds in her palm, and for the first time, something like softness flickered across his face. He didn't speak, but his eyes softened. He took a slow step forward, standing beside her, but not crowding her. His presence was steady, a constant in a world of shifting sand. For a long while, neither spoke. The stillness between them was thick, full of unspoken things. But the air between them no longer felt heavy with tension. It was lighter, as if the weight they carried had been split in two, made more bearable by the quiet companionship they shared. Then, the stillness was broken. A sound reached them both. Distant but growing louder. The unmistakable rumble of a horse's hooves. Min tensed, her muscles going rigid. Silas's eyes narrowed, instinctively moving into a more defensive stance, his body alert. They both knew that sound all too well. It was the sound of someone coming for trouble. It didn't take long for the rider to appear, his figure coming into view against the low light of the evening. It was Vance. His face was twisted in an ugly sneer, his eyes dark with something that went beyond anger. Silas didn't move. He simply watched, his eyes never leaving the approaching man. Vance reined in his horse near them, the animal snorting, the dust kicking up around his boots. The air between them crackled with hostility. "I knew it," Vance spat, his voice thick with malice. "The both of you think you can just come here and make your little stand, huh? You think I won't notice?" Min's heart slammed in her chest, but she didn't speak. She didn't move. She wasn't sure what to say or how to react. Vance had already made it clear that he saw her as nothing but a tool, a pawn in his little game. But Silas wasn't the same. Silas stood tall, his expression stone cold. "What do you want, Vance?" His voice was even, unwavering. "It's late. Whatever you've come for, I'm not interested." Vance laughed, the sound harsh and grating, like nails on a chalkboard. "You think this is over?" His eyes shifted toward Min, his gaze lingering too long. She's got no right to think she can just walk away from all this. Silas took a step forward, his posture casual, but the tension in the air was palpable. Min held her breath, watching them both. The moment stretched thin, full of promises and threats, none of them spoken. "I'm done with you," Silas said, his voice quiet but final. "You can't break her. You can't break me." Quote. Vance's eyes flickered with something close to rage, but he didn't move, he didn't speak. And after a long, drawn-out pause, he turned his horse and rode off, disappearing into the gathering dark. Silas watched him go, but Min didn't. She kept her eyes on the ground, the small pouch of sunflower seeds still in her hand. She hadn't asked for his protection, hadn't wanted his fight. But somehow, it had come anyway. And though she wasn't sure what the next day would bring, for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of something. Something that wasn't just survival, something more. The following days passed in a tense rhythm. The work didn't stop. The sun didn't stop. Neither did the biting winds or the dust that clung to everything, like a second skin. But something in the air had shifted, ever so slightly. There was a quiet tension between Silas and Min, a kind of unspoken understanding that neither dared to break. The harsh landscape around them, with its never-ending toil, had become something more than just a backdrop. It had become a witness to something beginning, something neither of them had expected. Min worked with a newfound determination, but there was a change in her movements. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was trying to live. Each step she took in the field, each sack she hoisted, each root she pulled from the dry earth, was done with a kind of silent defiance. Silas's presence, though quiet, had become a part of her rhythm, like the sound of her own heartbeat. She found herself looking for him more often, though she couldn't explain why. There were moments when their paths would cross in the fields, and they would exchange only brief glances, silent, yet understanding. In these exchanges, she saw strength in him that felt like the land itself. Unyielding, steadfast, and yet oddly gentle. It was a quiet strength that didn't demand, didn't expect, and yet, somehow, still gave more than anything else she had known. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the jagged horizon, Silas was at the well, drawing water. The sound of the bucket splashing against the surface of the water was the only noise in the thickening dusk. Min approached quietly, her boots crunching softly on the dirt as she moved toward him. "Need some help?" she asked, her voice low, a hint of something uncertain in it. She hadn't offered help before. It wasn't something she was used to doing. But something in her had shifted, something that made her feel like she needed to say it. Silas looked up at her, his face softening for just a moment. His eyes lingered on her, as if seeing her in a way he hadn't before. "I can manage," he said, but there was something in the way he said it. A quiet gratitude that didn't need words. Min watched him for a moment, unsure of what to do with the silence that stretched between them. She had always been alone. She had always done things alone. And yet, standing here now, with Silas just a few feet away, she felt something she couldn't name. She took a step closer, then another, and before she knew it, she was standing beside him, her hand reaching for the rope. The two of them worked in silence, each drawing a bucket of water, their movements syncing without words. There was something intimate about the simplicity of it, the shared task, the shared space. When they finished, Silas handed her the full bucket. She hesitated, but then she took it, her fingers brushing his briefly as she did. It was a small thing, an unspoken connection, but it was enough to make her heart race. As she turned to head back to her shack, she didn't look back, but she could feel him watching her. She felt it like a presence behind her, something that made her step just a little lighter, her shoulders a little less heavy. It was a strange feeling, like being seen for the first time. The next day, as the heat of the midday sun pressed down on them, a new kind of tension filled the air. There was no sign of Vance, no hint of trouble coming from the foreman. Yet, Min couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. And it did, in the form of Jedediah Thorn. He rode into the fields that afternoon, his black stallion kicking up dust as he made his way toward the workers. Min caught sight of him from a distance, his tall, lean figure cutting through the haze like a shadow. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest. He was a man who exuded power, but it wasn't a power that came from strength. It was a power that came from control. And the way he looked at her, the way his eyes lingered on her, made her skin crawl. Silas, who had been digging ditches again, noticed Thorn's arrival as well. His hand tightened around the shovel's handle, his jaw clenching. Min could feel his eyes on her, as if warning her. But there was nothing to be done. Thorn was coming, and there was no way to escape him now. As Thorn's horse neared, Min felt the weight of his gaze upon her. She kept her head down, pretending to focus on her work, though her heart was beating wildly in her chest. She had never been good at hiding her fear, and the way Thorn looked at her made her feel like an animal cornered by a predator. Thorn stopped just a few feet from her, his voice smooth and cold. "Min," he said, as if he were addressing a stray dog, "you've been doing well, haven't you?" She didn't look up. "I do my work," she said, her voice steady but her insides twisting. Thorn hummed, his gaze drifting over her. "Well, I suppose that's enough, for now." Min's stomach clenched. She could feel Silas's eyes on her now, his presence like a silent force in the background. She didn't want to draw attention. She didn't want to be seen, but here it was, all of it. The fear, the humiliation, the realization that Thorn's power was unshakable. Thorn turned his horse and gave a slight wave, as if he were dismissing her, before riding off toward the foreman's shack. Silas didn't move, but Min saw the way his muscles tensed, his hands gripping his shovel so tightly that his knuckles went white. She knew what he was thinking. He was thinking that it wouldn't be long before this moment came to a head, before Thorn decided he wanted something more than to just watch her suffer. But for now, it was just a small victory. She had survived another encounter. That evening, as Min sat alone outside her shack, the sun slipping behind the mountains, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Thorn wouldn't be satisfied forever, and neither would she. In the distance, Silas stood near the edge of the field, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. They hadn't spoken much since the water at the well, but the silence between them didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt like a space where something was waiting to be said, something unspoken, something both of them could feel but neither was ready to say out loud. The wind stirred, kicking up dust and shifting the land around her. But it was the quiet between them, the silent understanding, that carried the weight of everything. She took a deep breath, letting the moment hang between them, letting it fill her chest with something she didn't have the words for. Not yet. But soon. The tension in the air had grown thicker, like a storm ready to break. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the fields, while the heat of the day slowly started to surrender to the cool of the coming evening. But it wasn't the temperature that had changed. It was the silence between Silas and Min, the unspoken weight of everything that had been building over the past few days. Min felt it, even when they didn't speak. There was a quiet understanding between them now, an understanding born of shared labor, shared hardship, and an unspoken promise that neither of them could quite define. They were still two strangers in a world that didn't seem to care. But now, when their paths crossed, there was something different. Something not quite friendship, not quite love, but something real. A quiet bond that could only be forged in the fire of this place. The work continued, brutal and unyielding. The field stretched out before them, an endless expanse of dirt and sweat. But for once, Min didn't feel entirely alone in it. Silas was there, always nearby, a steady presence in the harsh rhythm of the ranch. Whether it was in the fields, the ditch, or by the well, he was there, always at the edge of her vision. It wasn't a comfort, not exactly, but it was enough. And then, one afternoon, it happened. The wind shifted, stirring the dust in the air. The sun hung high in the sky, and for a moment, it felt like everything paused. Like the land held its breath. Silas had been digging in his trench, as he always did, but today was different. Min felt it in her bones. A rider approached from the distance, moving fast, his horse kicking up the dust in a cloud. At first, she thought it was just another worker returning from the town. But then, as the figure grew closer, she recognized the silhouette. It was Vance. The foreman's presence was like a storm cloud on the horizon. The workers began to shift uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze, turning their attention back to their tasks. But Min, for the first time in a long while, didn't look away. She didn't have to. Vance rode right past the workers, his eyes scanning the field, the barn, the workers in their worn clothes. His gaze lingered on Min, just a little too long, as if he were sizing her up, deciding what to do next. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn her head. She simply met his gaze, holding it for a beat longer than she should have. Silas, who had been watching from the edge of the field, saw the exchange. His jaw tightened, his hand gripping the handle of his shovel, his eyes narrowing. But he didn't move. Not yet. Vance dismounted near the foreman's shack, his boots kicking up dust as he stepped onto the dry earth. The other workers, already accustomed to his presence, didn't even look up. But Silas couldn't let it go. There was something in the way Vance looked at Min, something that made his blood boil. He set the shovel down, his boots scraping against the dirt as he moved toward her. "Let's take a break," Silas said quietly, his voice low but firm. "You've been at it all day." Min met his gaze, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, but she didn't hesitate. She nodded, and together they walked toward the edge of the field, away from the watchful eyes of the other workers. Silas kept a few paces ahead, his gaze never leaving Vance, who had started to speak to the foreman in a low, heated tone. Min could feel the pressure building, but she didn't say anything. She just followed him, her steps slow, deliberate. When they reached the small patch of shade beneath a few sparse cottonwood trees, Silas stopped. He didn't look at her immediately. Instead, his eyes were fixed on the distance, on the man who had made this place a living hell for so many. Min stood beside him, her back to the tree. She could feel the weight of his silence pressing down on her, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was expected. She had gotten used to silences, to living in the spaces between words. It was how she had survived. But Silas was different. He didn't break the silence with forced conversation. He simply stood there, his presence solid and unshakable, like a mountain that had weathered every storm. After a long moment, he finally spoke. "He won't stop," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Not until he breaks you." Quote. Min's throat tightened at the words, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. She had known it for a long time. She had seen it in Vance's eyes, in Thorne's smirk. The cruelty was inevitable. The cruelty was their power. "I'm not broken," Min said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling in her chest. Silas turned toward her then, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark but focused. "Not yet," he murmured, almost to himself. They stood there for a while longer, neither of them speaking, neither of them moving. It was like a silent truce in a world that didn't know how to make peace. But soon, they would have no choice. The storm was coming, and neither of them could avoid it any longer. By the time the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the tension between them had only grown. The ranch had settled into a restless quiet, the workers returning to their shacks for the night, the air heavy with unspoken words and fear. Min stood at the door of her shack, staring out at the darkening land. She had never felt so trapped, so bound to a place that had never cared about her. But there was something now, something small yet powerful, a seed buried deep inside her. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was preparing for the fight. And Silas? He was waiting too, though he never said it. His presence beside her was more than just protection. It was an unspoken promise that he would not let her face it alone. They were in this together, for better or worse. That night, as the moon rose over the barren landscape, Min found herself awake, lying in her small bed, her thoughts churning. She had lived her entire life in this place, under this sun, under this weight. And for so long, she had thought that was all she could do. But now, with Silas at her side, it felt different. For the first time, she could almost taste what freedom might taste like. It was sweet, bitter, and terrifying all at once. She wasn't going to wait for it to come. She was going to take it. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the valley, Min knew that the time had come, and the storm that had been brewing would soon break. The air was thick with anticipation, like the calm before the storm. The sun had barely begun to rise, its golden light creeping over the valley, but already the fields were alive with movement. Workers went about their tasks, but there was an unease among them, a sense of something building, something inevitable, like a dam waiting to break. Min stood outside her shack, the cool morning breeze ruffling her hair, her gaze distant. The small bundle she had packed the night before was at her feet, just a few things she could carry. The only things that mattered were in that bundle: a handful of sunflower seeds, some clothes, a few small possessions. Everything else, the labor, the sweat, the fear, was behind her now. She could feel Silas before she saw him, the weight of his presence always a steady force. He approached quietly, as always, his boots kicking up dust with each step. But today, his steps were purposeful, like a man who knew exactly where he was going. Without a word, he stopped in front of her, his eyes scanning the landscape, the land that had held them both in its grasp for so long. And yet, it wasn't the land he was looking at. It was her. Min could feel his eyes on her, steady and unwavering, and for a moment the weight of everything hung between them. They didn't need to speak. Not now. Without breaking the silence, Silas reached down and took her hand, his fingers warm and strong, the touch both comforting and final. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. In that moment, Min felt the promise of escape, of freedom, of a life that was waiting for them beyond the dust and the sun. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. "You ready?" Silas asked, his voice quiet, but filled with a quiet certainty. Min nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. It had taken everything she had to get here, to make this choice. To leave behind the only world she had ever known, the world that had shaped her, broken her, and now offered her the chance to escape. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. With one last look at the place that had held her captive for so long, she stepped away from her shack, her hand still firmly in Silas's. Together they moved toward the horses, their lives now tied to the road ahead. They didn't look back. The road was long, the dust rising in the air as they made their way through the valley. The sky above was an endless stretch of blue, and the wind carried the scent of change, of something new on the horizon. The world was wide and open now, and for the first time in her life, Min felt it. She felt free. But freedom was never easy. It wasn't a gift. It was something earned, something fought for. And the road ahead was still uncertain, filled with dangers that neither of them could predict. But Min knew one thing for sure. She would face it with Silas by her side. They rode in silence, the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves, the only sound between them. The valley slowly receded behind them, replaced by the open road ahead. It was a road that would lead them to places they had never seen, to a life they had never imagined. But it was theirs, their future, their fight, their choice. Hours passed, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they stopped by a small creek to rest. The water sparkled in the fading light, a quiet reflection of the peace that seemed to settle over them. Silas dismounted first, his movements easy and practiced. He reached up and helped Min down from the horse, his hands steady on her waist as he guided her to the soft ground. The world around them felt different here, more alive, more real, and for the first time in a long while, Min felt a sense of hope she hadn't known she was capable of. She sat beside him, the two of them silent for a moment, simply watching the water trickle past them. It wasn't a grand moment. It wasn't a declaration of love or some fiery passion. It was quiet, unassuming, and that was enough. "This is it, isn't it?" Min asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though the question hung between them like a truth they both knew but hadn't said aloud. Silas nodded, his gaze on the water. "This is it." Quote, there was no need for more words. They didn't need to explain what they both understood. They had found each other in this harsh world, in this unforgiving land, and that was enough. The stars began to appear in the sky above them, the first faint dots of light in the growing darkness. They lay back on the cool earth, side by side, and looked up at the endless sky. There was something peaceful about it, something vast and quiet, like the promise of a future still waiting to unfold. "Where do we go from here?" Min asked after a long silence, her voice soft, almost uncertain. "We go wherever we want," Silas replied, his tone light, but with a quiet certainty that only someone who had walked through darkness could carry. Min smiled, the weight of everything she had left behind still pressing on her heart, but in this moment, the weight was bearable. With Silas beside her, the world felt possible again. And so, they lay beneath the stars, their future unwritten but full of promise. It was a beginning. The road ahead was long, and the world was still a hard place. But for the first time, it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough to carry them through whatever came next. Together, they had found freedom, and together they would face whatever came, hand in hand, riding into the unknown.